Welcome to Mysteries and Crime, where the lines between fact and fiction blur in humanity's darkest corners. Tonight, we uncover the chilling case of Pedro Lopez, infamously known as the Monster of the Andes. Could you piece together his twisted motives before we reveal the truth? And here's your clue for tonight. What connection did Pedro Lopez have with his choice of victims? Pedro Lopez, one of history's most prolific serial killers, preyed upon the vulnerable girls of Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru during the 1970s and 1980s. With a confirmed confession to over 300 murders, his crimes left a trail of heartbreak and fear across the Andes, forever changing the region's history. It was a bustling market in Ecuador in 1980 when Pedro Lopez was caught in the act. A courageous vendor noticed a man attempting to lure a young girl away from her mother and raised the alarm. Chaos erupted as Lopez was restrained by locals, and his dark secrets began to unravel. Initially, authorities dismissed him as just another petty criminal, but as they interrogated him, his demeanor shifted, and his confessions left detectives reeling. He chillingly described the burial sites of hundreds of young girls, offering details that no one else could have known. Police were led to desolate, makeshift graves across the Andes, where the remains of his victims were unearthed. In one grim discovery, investigators found several skulls lined up, as if Lopez had returned to admire his work. The horror shocked even the most seasoned detectives, as Lopez claimed he had spared no mercy for his victims. This was the beginning of a case that would reveal not only the depravity of one man, but also systemic failures in justice systems across South America. How had a killer like Pedro Lopez managed to evade capture for so long? The answers were buried as deep as the secrets of his crimes. Pedro Lopez targeted young girls between the tender ages of 8 and 12, innocent children who often came from impoverished families with little to no means of protection. These were children from the margins of society. Many worked as street vendors, helping their families scrape together a living, or lived in isolated rural communities where police presence was scarce and danger lurked unnoticed. Lopez's methods were disturbingly effective. He would approach his victims with calculated charm, luring them with small gifts, promises of food, or most disturbingly, with false displays of kindness that made him appear trustworthy. The stories of the victims are heartbreaking. Snapshots of innocence lost. Ana Maria, an 11-year-old girl from Ecuador, dreamed of becoming a teacher one day, a dream that ended when she vanished on her way to school, her books still clutched in her tiny hands. Claudia, a bright 9-year-old girl in Colombia, spent her days helping her mother sell fruit in the bustling market. She loved the energy of the crowd and the pride of helping her family. But one fateful day, when she ventured off to buy supplies, she never came back. Each name represents a life tragically cut short, a family left in unbearable grief, and dreams extinguished before they could even take root. Parents were left to mourn in silence, often without answers or closure. In a society riddled with poverty, systemic neglect played an undeniable role, leaving these children vulnerable to predators like Pedro Lopez, whose heinous acts thrived in an environment of indifference. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of Lopez's crimes was his calculated, methodical approach. He deliberately sought out children who he believed wouldn't be missed, those who lived on the fringes, far from the protection of society's spotlight. This strategy ensured that his atrocities would go unnoticed for years, and for a long time, they did, allowing him to leave a trail of destruction across Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru without detection. For Lopez, these young girls were not individuals with lives and futures. They were simply means to his twisted ends. The absence of urgency from law enforcement and society at large only emboldened him, allowing him to carry out his horrific crimes time and time again. This pattern of violence became his grim signature, a testament to the systemic failure that allowed his darkness to spread unchecked. And so, the cycle of heartbreak continued. As the Andes Mountains, with all their beauty, hid some of the darkest secrets ever to haunt South America. Pedro Lopez's life was a disturbing roadmap to his eventual crimes. Born in 1948 in Colombia, he was the son of a prostitute and raised amidst violence and neglect. By the age of 8, Lopez had been abandoned by his family and reportedly sexually abused by strangers. Lopez's formative years were marked by trauma, with repeated arrests for theft and violence in his teens. By adulthood, he had developed a twisted worldview, claiming he was cleaning the streets of sin through his murders. Authorities initially dismissed Lopez as a vagrant when he was caught in Ecuador, but during interrogations, his demeanor shifted. He spoke calmly about his crimes, even boasting about his achievements. This disarming confidence made investigators question how many other victims he may have claimed. Adding to the complexity, Lopez's crimes were committed across 3 countries, creating jurisdictional chaos. Different police forces struggled to connect his killings until his chilling confessions revealed a cross-border pattern. His upbringing and criminal history suggest a mix of nature and nurture in his development into one of history's most prolific killers. But his ability to evade justice for so long remains an open wound for investigators. Pedro Lopez's reign of terror spanned over a decade, leaving behind a trail of shattered families and devastated communities. His ability to evade capture for so long stemmed not just from his cunning and mobility, but also from the vulnerabilities of the societies he targeted. His modus operandi was chillingly consistent, and his charm was his weapon of choice. Lopez would frequent bustling markets and small rural villages, blending in among the crowds. He seemed unassuming, even harmless, as he zeroed in on young girls between the ages of 8 and 12. Children who were often overlooked by the very systems designed to protect them. Lopez's approach was disturbingly strategic. He preyed on the trusting innocence of his victims, earning their confidence with small tokens, perhaps a piece of candy, a toy, or the promise of a meal. In communities where poverty and hunger were rampant, these gestures carried significant weight, and Lopez knew how to exploit them. Once he had gained their trust, he would lead them away from the safety of the crowd and into the isolation of remote, desolate areas where no one could hear their cries for help. It was in these secluded places that Lopez revealed his true, monstrous nature. Survivors who narrowly escaped him described a man whose demeanor shifted from comforting to terrifying in an instant. One young girl recounted how he had posed as a concerned adult, offering to help her find her family. But as soon as they were alone, his intentions became violently clear. Lopez reportedly strangled his victims, a method that required him to face them as they died. In his chilling confessions, he described this as the most beautiful experience, words that horrified even the most hardened investigators. These statements offered a disturbing glimpse into the psyche of a man who found beauty in the suffering of others. A man who saw his victims not as children, but as objects for his twisted gratification. The aftermath of Lopez's crimes was as horrifying as the acts themselves. When authorities finally began uncovering the graves Lopez led them to, they found scenes straight out of a nightmare. In one location in Ecuador, over 50 bodies were unearthed, their remains serving as silent witnesses to the atrocities they endured. In some cases, skulls were arranged in meticulous lines, a macabre signature that hinted at Lopez's need for control, even in death. These grave sites were not merely places of burial. They were monuments to the unchecked evil of a man who seemed to take pride in his work. What made Lopez even more terrifying was his ability to move undetected. He seamlessly crossed borders between Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, taking advantage of the lack of communication and coordination between law enforcement agencies. Each new country offered him a fresh slate, a new group of victims, and the chance to continue his killing spree unimpeded. In those days, the interconnected databases and technological advancements we rely on today didn't exist, allowing Lopez to slip through the cracks time and time again. And yet, the full extent of his crimes remains unknown. Lopez confessed to murdering over 300 young girls, a number so staggering it is almost incomprehensible. While not all of these claims have been verified, the evidence uncovered thus far supports the horrifying scale of his atrocities. Each number in that tally represents a life cut tragically short, a family left in mourning, and a community left to grapple with fear and anger. Lopez's crimes were not just acts of violence. They were acts of domination and cruelty, calculated to strip his victims of their humanity. They reveal the chilling reality of how one man's depravity could thrive amidst systemic failures, societal neglect, and the silent spaces between borders. The story of Pedro Lopez is more than just a tale of a serial killer. It is a stark reminder of the vulnerabilities that exist in our world, vulnerabilities that allowed a monster to prey upon the most innocent for far too long. Police efforts to capture Lopez were plagued with obstacles, but persistence paid off in the end. Once apprehended in 1980, investigators were relentless in their questioning. Initially, Lopez refused to cooperate, but as the days stretched into weeks, cracks began to form in his facade. Under pressure, Lopez confessed to his crimes, leading authorities to multiple grave sites. These discoveries validated his claims and confirmed suspicions that a single individual was behind hundreds of disappearances. However, his ability to cross borders had allowed him to evade police for years, highlighting gaps in international collaboration. Forensic science in the 1970s and 1980s was limited, especially in rural South America. Many of Lopez's victims were buried in shallow graves, leaving little physical evidence for investigators to analyze. The state of decomposition made identification nearly impossible, adding to the anguish of families seeking closure. Modern re-examinations of the case have pointed out missed opportunities. Improved DNA analysis and global databases could have identified victims more quickly, but at the time, police relied heavily on Lopez's confessions and his maps of burial sites. Despite these challenges, his admissions offered a harrowing glimpse into the scale of his crimes. The community response to Lopez's crimes was one of shock and outrage. Fear gripped the streets of Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, as parents kept their children indoors and schools increased security. Rumors spread rapidly, painting Lopez as a monster who could strike anywhere, at any time. The media dubbed Pedro Lopez the monster of the Andes, fueling public hysteria with sensational headlines and chilling accounts of his crimes. International news outlets picked up the story, shining a light on South America's struggles with systemic poverty and law enforcement failures. The intense scrutiny also forced governments to confront their lack of resources, though for many families, justice came far too late. Lopez's confessions confirmed his role in hundreds of murders, but questions lingered. Were there accomplices? Did Lopez exaggerate his crimes to inflate his infamy? Some investigators speculated that Lopez may have been responsible for even more deaths, but gaps in records and jurisdictional chaos left these theories unresolved. Despite confessing to over 300 murders, Pedro Lopez's trial was riddled with controversy. He was convicted of killing 110 girls in Ecuador, but after serving just 14 years, he was released due to laws limiting incarceration lengths. His current whereabouts are unknown, leaving many to fear he could kill again. As the story of Pedro Lopez fades into the shadows, many questions remain. How many victims did he truly claim? Did he have accomplices? And most hauntingly, could he still be alive, walking among us? Lopez's crimes reshaped the Andes, leaving scars that will never heal. Communities mourned their lost children, while governments faced harsh criticism for failing to protect the most vulnerable. The case also brought international attention to the plight of impoverished families in South America. As we close the chapter on the monster of the Andes, we are left with more questions than answers. Did you catch tonight's clue? What connection did Pedro Lopez have with his choice of victims? Share your theories below, and remember, stay curious, stay vigilant, and stay safe.